This penultimate episode of my defense of virtue ethics is a little bit unusual, in that it deals with a criticism which more often comes from consequentialists rather than from duty and rights-based deontologists. Probably because it amounts to pointing out a problem with duty-based ethics and then attempting to deploy it against virtue ethics. The problem of conflicting duties reapplied to conflicting virtues, as it were. The criticism from conflict is often made in the form of a simple, destructive dilemma, wherein, for example, a virtue like honesty conflicts with a virtue like kindness, where being honest would mean telling a hurtful truth, whilst being kind would mean remaining silent or even lying. From instances like this, where V1 would be honesty and V2 kindness, the criticism can be generalized as follows. Firstly, it is claimed that there is no possible situation wherein virtue ethics works, but where it's not possible for virtue ethics to prioritize V1 over V2. And that there is no possible situation wherein virtue works, but where it's not possible for virtue ethics to prioritize V2 over V1. In other words, that the job of virtue ethics is to prioritize conflicting virtues, so that we may decide which ones to act out, and that virtue ethics therefore stands or falls on whether or not it can do this. It is then claimed that it's impossible for virtue ethics to prioritize any virtue over any other with which it may conflict, be it, for example, prioritizing kindness over honesty or honesty over kindness. In other words, all virtues are of equal priority in any moral system which identifies the good with the virtuous. From these two premises, critics conclude that virtue ethics does not work, and thereby fails as moral reasoning. So how could a virtue ethicist respond to such a criticism? Well, firstly, there's horn grabbing. That is, the virtue ethicist may provide counterexamples to the first premise by describing situations wherein virtue ethics works, even though we are unable to prioritize between particular virtues. The virtue ethicist might, for example, point out that whilst poorly understood higher level virtues like honesty and kindness might resist prioritization in their own terms, a more substantial understanding of ends might enable prioritization by, for example, synthesizing further, more generalized virtues like prudence, virtues which can stand in judgment of subsidiary virtues when they conflict in particular situations. This approach also offers a response to the second premise of the criticism, by going between the horns of the dilemma, by describing how it may be possible to prioritize one virtue over another when there is some idea of a hierarchical understanding, as potentially yielded by empirical investigation into teleonomy. On the strength of this response, it would seem that virtue ethicists can make adequate response to their consequentialist critics, as difficult as it may be for deontologists to do the same, given their appeals to somewhat less flexible duties, rights, and obligations. There is then, as yet, with only one episode to go, nothing contrary to cogent argument in being a virtue ethicist, which is, in my opinion, a good thing. Because I think virtue ethics serves progressive political ambitions, like mine, somewhat better than the current deontological orthodoxy. Next time, I conclude this series by examining the criticisms from situational effacement. Thank you for listening.